And we're back. So we just got done talking about compressors here, all the different controls. We didn't necessarily go over the knee. Just as a quick review over the knee, check out the center point right where the audio would cross the threshold, and watch what happens when you increase the knee. You start to round off that initial break at the threshold. So basically, what that is doing is that as audio starts to approach the threshold, we start to see a gradual reduction in audio until it reaches the ratio that you have set, right? You can just tell by the graphic there what the ratio is doing. Um, for uh, for a knee that is really abrupt right at the threshold, we call that what's known as a hard knee. A knee that is really rounded and smooth at that threshold, we call it a soft knee. So, hard knee and soft knee. Let's take a listen to what that sounds like before we move on to this next section. You may have or not heard that with a really hard knee, it tends to sound a little more aggressive, a little more abrupt, a little more edgy, right? With a soft knee, it tends to sound a little more natural, a little more rounded, not as harsh, not as abrupt. Maybe some people might say more musical, less affected, right? But that's something you might want to play with here. Again, just use your ears, but that is technically what's happening is that as it approaches the threshold, it gradually starts to move towards the ratio that you've set here until the level goes so high that it reaches that ratio and it's being reduced to whatever you have set here. As the level goes below the threshold, it starts to gradually go back to its original level. Okay. Great. So let's see how this affects our next process, which is known as a gate. Okay. Um, we see. Wait. Now, wait a minute. That looks almost exactly the same as this other one was. What is the difference? The main difference between a gate and a compressor. With a compressor, anything above the threshold gets reduced. On a gate, anything below the threshold gets reduced. But before we move on, let's just hear what this is doing. This is the stock level, the stock settings here. Let's just see what we have available to us with just the stock settings of this compressor. So obviously you can see that anytime the level goes above that threshold, it opens up, and anytime it goes below it, which would be towards the end of um, the waveform or the tail end of the waveform, it starts to chomp down on it. So it's almost literally like going in here and editing your audio to do something like this, right? This is basically what a gate would do. But it doesn't do exactly this. So you have a little more say in it, right? So that's if you were doing something really abrupt where you had a very fast attack time and a very fast release time, right? So fast that it's just instant. As soon as the audio goes above any amount, it turns on, and as soon as it goes below that threshold, it just gets chopped off, right? So it'd be the equivalent of something like that, right? Now with attack um, with a gate, you can really think of it as like creating or creating fade ins and fade outs for your audio, right? The attack setting is going to allow you to make a crossfade that's a certain um, uh, uh, length, a certain time amount, right? So a really slow attack is going to give a fade that looks something like that, right? A really fast attack is going to give you a fade that looks something like that, okay? Same with release. It's as if you take the last part of the waveform, and before you And when it crosses that waveform, it gives you a little bit of time to release it, so it could maybe sound a little more natural rather than just an abrupt sound here. Okay, so let's take a listen to what that might sound like. Well, keep that in mind while we're listening to this. Ooh, too far. While we're listening to this track with this gate on here. Okay, I'm gonna reset these back to the normal preference here, which is as hold down Option and click on the setting. And let's start adjusting these things. Listen for those fade ins and fade outs that you would see. You can look at this as your marker, or you can just take a listen. Yeah, very clear that you can kind of hear that fade in moving in and out on each hit, right? Let's do the release now. The fade out. Pretty cool. So a gate can actually save you a lot of time editing your audio, um, especially if you have a lot of bleed or something like that. We were just talking about how that might have been an issue at the beginning of this track, right? So on a snare drum, when something is even, it's an even level amount, and it's really quick and snappy. Snare drums, toms. Um, I find I'm using gates on a lot. Um, it helps to cut down on the bleed from other instruments, but also kind of helps with the editing process, in where you don't have to edit out any unnecessary noise in between, right? I usually put a gate at the beginning of a track so that I can control that before hitting my EQ, before hitting my compressor, and I can really start to control the sound of the track. Now, this might sound really unnatural to you guys, and that's totally cool. Um, but remember that on a drum kit, we usually have overheads, we have other fill mics, room mics, right? And that usually fills in all the blank areas that you might get from listening to a gate. It sounds weird on its own, but mixed in together, it's actually can sound really, really great. So let's take a listen. Now you might hear a little bit of like a artifact underneath, right? That might be due to this range setting here. Now watch it. Just look at the range setting and see what you notice. You see how the gain reduction meter goes up and down? This is just kind of giving you an idea, like, well, if you miss some of the bleed of some of the other instruments, maybe you want to bring them back in and only reduce to it by about 12 dB after it goes down after it um, goes below the threshold, right? So you can actually hear the bleed go up and down when you adjust this range. Sounds a little more natural, right? It almost sounds we just turned the other instruments down and left the snare drum by itself. Almost like got a little more separation just by adjusting that range, right? So that's something really cool to kind of take note of, right? But it's the same controls as we had before. We set our ratio, we set our threshold, attack and release are giving us that fade in, fade out kind of sound, right? A little easier to understand on a gate actually than on a compressor. Cool. Now let's go back to let's go to limiters. Okay, I'm going to pull up a limiter here, and it's going to seem very familiar. This DIN 3. Notice the name of the plugin. It's called the DIN 3 compressor limiter. So where's the limiter section of this of this plugin? I don't see it. Well, it's hidden because all a limiter is a compressor with a very large ratio. Usually 15 to 1 or 20 to 1 is depending on what textbook or person or Joe on the street you talk to about what limiting is. But always known as to be 20 to 1 or more, right? Um, Now, if you can obviously go to 100 to 1 or greater, but basically what a limiter is just a really aggressive compressor, meaning that anything that goes above this threshold gets smashed down, right? And this might be something you put towards the end of a track or end of a mix to control everything, right? To use it at the beginning of a mix, it can cause some issues because it's so dramatic. It's kind of like I don't know, adding like a lot of spices um, to a dish right away without allowing them to kind of marinate, right? You need a little time with your tracks before you start limiting. But sometimes you might use it right away. Whatever sounds great, you know. But I've noticed with using limiters, using them towards the end of a mix or at the end of a chain might help it, right? Because all we want to do is control it, you know. So that is the only difference between a compressor and a limiter is the ratio, right? All the other parts of the parameters of a limiter are going to be different. Um, and it's going to all the each compressor or limiter is going to look or feel different, sound maybe a little different, but the basics of it is just the ratio setting. Okay, anything above about 20 to 1 is our limiter. Okay, so that's the difference. Let me show you a couple other limiters. I have let's see what's a really great one. Oh, one of my favorite ones of all is in this isotope ozone plugin. This is a fancy plugin, but just to show you one that is used a lot in the industry, this vintage limiter is just sounds so awesome. I really like this one. But I just to show you how I use it, I almost never use it at the beginning stage of a mix. I usually use it on a mix bus, like for maybe at the end of my drum chain or the end of my vocals or something like that. Or I use it on my master fader just to adjust a little bit. For the most part, when you're doing um, using compression, you're usually not compressing any more than 2 or 3 dB. That's usually the case. If you find yourself you have to limit more, there's usually something in your mix that you want you want to compensate for before going to the limiter. But just to show you how this one would work, right? If I want a perfect kick snare drum sound, now this is going to get a little bit louder, so you might want to adjust your levels now. There we are. Okay, now let's see what this one might sound like. Now, obviously, that is so much louder than my actual track is, right? But what you see commonly in limiters is something called a ceiling, which says like how loud, once you start reducing the level by having the threshold meet the dynamic range of your track, how loud do you want it to be compensated for? What's the peak level you're going to be looking for? And right now I just set it to like the loudest level that I can get without clipping, right? Um, that may be the case in the limiter that you might end up using. But for this one in the comp limiter, we'd have to adjust the level at the gain stage of this, right? So let's try that with this plugin and see if we can get the same similar result. Okay. See, a lot harder to control with this one, but you can still get the same desired effect, right? You just have to know what your plugin is capable of doing, right? So that's gating and limiting for you. The last one we can talk about, which is something we kind of already did, was with this. Here I moved my gate up here, which is with this range builder or this range selection here. You see how there's a portion where there's this transition from like the lower part of the audio and the higher part of the audio. Um, this is a way to make more dynamic range with your audio. Now, what does that mean? Remember, dynamic range is just what's the quietest part of your audio and what's the loudest part of your audio, right? What a gate does essentially is lower all the quiet parts of your audio, right? To whatever level you want, right? And then maintains everything else above a certain threshold. So what have you done? You've lowered the noise floor, and you've maintained the attack here, which is the highest part of your dynamic range. So you've increased dynamic range. This is what's called expansion, right? Which is why you see the EXP next to the name of this plugin, right? So the range section actually turns this into an expander, which increases dynamic range. It's almost the opposite of a compressor, where a compressor reduces peaks and brings up noise floor. A expander increases peaks and reduces noise floor and makes more dynamics, right? But I kind of think of it as a way of helping with the editing process, so you don't have to go in and edit different parts within your section, right? So in these later videos, we're going to talk about different ways of using compressors on different instruments, and then using it in a mix, and how you might want to mix in a particular track, in particular vocals, when using compressors. All right, guys. See you in the next one.